Professional wrestling has always had its down years, periods where booking faltered, buy rates slipped, and crowds thinned. But World Championship Wrestling in 1993 wasn't just experiencing a slump, it was spiraling toward disaster. The year was marked by such severe mismanagement and internal chaos that by December, the company was reportedly on the brink of extinction, having lost anywhere from $10 to $23 million and nearly been shut down by its parent company, Turner Broadcasting. One more failed pay-per-view could have ended WCW entirely, 8 years earlier than its eventual collapse. What makes the situation even more staggering is that the talent was never the problem. Vader, Sting, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Rick Rude, Steve Austin, Brian Pillman, and Lord Steven Regal were all delivering top-tier performances, leaving no logical explanation for how a roster this stacked managed to bleed money at such a catastrophic rate. But WCW found a way. They always found a way. January 1993. It was the first domino to fall. Bill Watts had been running WCW since 1992. Watts was old school. Cowboy Bill, they called him. He came from the territory days. He knew how to book wrestling, and he knew how to get guys over. Creatively, his run had actually produced some solid television and some genuinely good matches. The problem was everything else. Watts had implemented a series of bizarre rules that drove the talent crazy. He removed the safety mats at ringside, which meant guys were landing on concrete when they took bumps to the outside. He banned moves off the top rope. That was like telling a musician they could not use certain chords. He was trying to run a 1990s national television product like it was Mid-South Wrestling in 1984. And the financial numbers were disastrous. Then came the final nail in the coffin. Before Watts was even hired by WCW, he had given an interview to the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter in which he made a series of racially inflammatory comments, including expressing support for a segregationist restaurant owner. WCW leadership had apparently been aware of the interview when they hired him, but in early 1993, wrestling journalist Mark Madden brought it to the attention of Hank Aaron, the baseball legend who was a vice president within the Turner organization. Aaron pushed for Watts to be removed. By February 1993, Watts had been stripped of his decision-making power and resigned, though the exact circumstances of whether he quit or was forced out remain disputed to this day. Jim Ross, who had been the voice of WCW television, was unhappy that the new regime had placed Eric Bischoff above him and resigned shortly after. The entire leadership structure was thrown into chaos. And then came the question that would define the entire year. Who takes over? Tony Schiavone apparently thought he was next in line. He was not. Instead, the job of executive producer was handed to Eric Bischoff, with Ole Anderson taking over as vice president of wrestling operations. Now, in 1993, Eric Bischoff was not the swaggering Monday Night Wars general that people remember from later years. He was a commentator, a guy who hosted shows and called the action on World Championship Wrestling television. His previous wrestling experience had been working for Laverne Clarence's American Wrestling Association since 1987, starting as an errand runner before working his way up to announcer and host. He was there when the American Wrestling Association folded in 1991, and he had made his way to World Championship Wrestling shortly after. That was his resume. But Bischoff was ambitious, he was hungry, and he had ideas. Unfortunately, many of those ideas in 1993 were terrible. The single most damaging decision Bischoff made that year was the implementation of block tapings at the Disney MGM studios in Orlando. Those Disney MGM block tapings would define the rest of the year. On paper, the concept sounded reasonable. Instead of running house shows all over the country, burning money on travel and production for crowds that were getting smaller and smaller, WCW would tape massive blocks of television content in one location over one weekend. Brighter lights, a controlled environment, a studio audience. It would save money and look better on television. In practice, it was a nightmare. One of the most damaging operational decisions in the history of professional wrestling. WCW would tape up to 4 months' worth of programming over a long weekend at Disney. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 months of television content for their syndicated shows. That meant every title change, every storyline development, every surprise twist, every dramatic confrontation was locked in weeks and weeks before it ever aired on television. There was no flexibility, no ability to adjust to injuries, no ability to capitalize when someone got unexpectedly hot with the audience, no ability to course correct when something was not working. Everything was carved in stone, and it got worse. The fans in the audience at Disney were tourists, families on vacation, people who had wandered over from Space Mountain and thought this might be a fun way to kill an hour. They were not wrestling fans. They did not know who anyone was. They did not care about the storylines. And because WCW needed them to react the right way for the cameras, the production staff literally told the audience who to cheer and who to boo. They held up signs, they coached reactions. The whole thing was manufactured from top to bottom, but the real catastrophe was the leaks. Word got out almost immediately about what had been taped. In an era before the internet had fully taken hold, but where wrestling newsletters and hotlines were thriving, the results of matches that would not air for weeks or even months were public knowledge within days of being taped. Fans knew who was going to win. Fans knew which titles were going to change hands. Every single surprise was spoiled before it ever reached the airwaves. This created a cascading series of problems that WCW could never get ahead of. Here is a perfect example. WCW had a plan for the tag team titles. The Four Horsemen were supposed to lose a title match to the Hollywood Blondes during the Disney tapings, with the plan being to do a swerve and then put the belts back on the Horsemen at a later Clash of Champions special. Smart booking, in theory. Create a false sense of security and then pull the rug out. But then Brian Pillman got injured between those two events. Suddenly, WCW had a massive problem. They had already taped weeks of footage showing the Horsemen as champions. That footage was going to start airing on syndicated television imminently. They could not just pretend it did not exist. So they scrambled and put Lord Steven Regal in as a substitute partner for Steve Austin, which meant Regal was effectively handed half of the tag team championships, not because of any storyline logic, but because the pre-taped content demanded it. WCW never attempted another major swerve like that for the rest of the year. They could not. The system they had built made it impossible, and the fans who had already heard the leaked results had zero reason to tune in with any sense of anticipation. The product was dead on arrival every single week. Now, while the Disney tapings were slowly strangling the television product, WCW was simultaneously making a mess of its championship picture. And that one requires some background. WCW had historically been part of the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA. The NWA was the governing body that sanctioned the World Heavyweight Championship, the Big Gold Belt, the most prestigious title in the history of the business. WCW had already split from the NWA once before, when Ric Flair left for the World Wrestling Federation in 1991, and since then, the relationship had been awkward at best. By 1993, the NWA had reconstituted itself and was trying to promote its own world champion again. At a big show in Tokyo in January, the Great Muta held the NWA title, and WCW wanted to transition that belt to their own wrestler Barry Windham. The NWA agreed. Windham won the title. And then WCW decided they did not need the NWA anymore and pulled out of the alliance entirely while Windham was still holding their championship. Then, to really pour gasoline on the fire, WCW claimed that the physical championship belt itself, the Big Gold Belt, actually belonged to them, and they were keeping it. The NWA was furious. Lawsuits were filed. Legal threats went back and forth. Eventually, it was settled that the NWA could promote its own champion, and WCW had to stop using the NWA name entirely. By this point, Ric Flair had come back to WCW and won the title from Windham. So now WCW had Flair holding this belt that was no longer the NWA title, but was not exactly the WCW World title either, because Vader was already the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. Any reasonable promotion would have simply merged the belts, had Flair challenge Vader, unified the championships, and moved on with life. Simple, clean, Easy for the fans to understand. WCW did none of that. Instead, they invented something called the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship. They created a fictional international board of governors that supposedly sanctioned this new title. They declared that Flair was the WCW International World Champion and that this belt was roughly equal in prestige to Vader's WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Nobody bought it. Nobody cared. Nobody understood why there were two world champions in the same promotion when they could have just unified the damn titles and been done with it. The whole thing was confusing, needlessly complicated, and made the company look like it did not know what it was doing. Fans watching at home were left scratching their heads trying to figure out which championship mattered more, which champion they were supposed to take seriously, and why a company that already had a perfectly good world title felt the need to create a second one. It existed in some bizarre parallel universe of fictional international governing bodies. It was the kind of decision that could only be made by people who had completely lost the plot. And speaking of not knowing what they were doing, let us talk about the Hollywood Blondes. Steve Austin and Brian Pillman were magic together. Pure magic. Their chemistry was effortless. Their matches were extraordinary. Their promos were sharp and funny and arrogant in exactly the way that makes people want to pay money to see someone punch you in the face. Their catchphrase, "Your brush with greatness is over," was genuinely over with the fans. People hated them passionately, which in wrestling is the highest compliment you can pay a heel tag team. By early 1993, the Blondes were so undeniably hot that WCW had no choice but to put the tag team titles on them. And here is the thing that drove WCW management crazy. Austin and Pillman had gotten over by essentially ignoring what WCCW told them to do. They had built their following through hard work, great matches, and force of personality. They had not followed the script. They had not done things the WCW way. And by succeeding on their own terms, they had implicitly proven that WCW management was wrong about them. WCW could not tolerate that. So after approximately 5 months as champions, the Blondes were broken up, just like that. The hottest act in the company was dismantled because management could not stand the fact that they had been proven wrong. Pillman was turned babyface in what proved to be a disastrous career move. Austin was given vague promises of a singles push toward the world title that never materialized. The best tag team WCW had produced in a decade was destroyed for no reason other than petty backstage politics. Steve Austin has talked about this for years. This was a formative experience for him. The bitterness he carried from his WCW years, the feeling of being held down and overlooked by people who did not recognize what they had, all of that fuel eventually powered the most successful character in wrestling history when he got to the World Wrestling Federation. WCW's loss, literally. And while the Blondes were being sabotaged, WCW made the baffling decision to reform the Four Horsemen. Now, the Horsemen are one of the most legendary factions in wrestling history. Flair, Anderson, Tully, Wyndham, the original lineups had been iconic. Any new version needed to feel special. It needed to feel like an event. It needed to have the right members. WCW chose Paul Roma. Paul Roma. The man had spent his entire World Wrestling Federation career as a mid-card tag team wrestler. He was best known as one half of Power and Glory with Hercules, a mid-card tag team act that never sniffed the main event. He had never been positioned as a main event talent anywhere. This was the man WCW decided should stand alongside Ric Flair and Arn Anderson as a horseman. The fans rejected it immediately. Roma did not look like a horseman. He did not carry himself like a horseman. He did not belong anywhere near that lineage. The decision cheapened the brand of the Horseman and confused fans who expected someone, anyone, more credible in that spot. It became one of the defining symbols of how out of touch WCW management was in 1993. But we are not done yet. Not even close. because WCW still had the rest of the year to fill, and they were going to fill it with some of the worst signings and worst gimmicks the company had ever produced. This was the year that WCW brought in Max Payne, a guitar-playing villain whose gimmick was that he played painful music. They brought in the Equalizer, later known as Avad Sullivan, a man widely considered one of the worst professional wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. They brought in the Colossal Kongs, two enormously overweight men with no discernible wrestling ability. They brought in Ice Train, whose entire character was built around the catchphrase, "Choo Choo." They brought in Honky Tonk Man and tried to position him as a serious contender for the television championship. They took Road Warrior Hawk, one half of one of the greatest tag teams of all time, and tried to run him as a singles wrestler. They brought in Ray Traylor, formerly the Big Boss Man, and repackaged him as the Boss, a character so legally similar to his World Wrestling Federation gimmick that it would eventually cause problems. All of these people were hired. All of them were paid real money. All of them were given television time and pushed to varying degrees. None of them got over. None of them drew money. None of them meant anything to the fans. But WCW kept shoving them down the audience's throat because somewhere along the line, someone had decided that WCW needed to be more like the World Wrestling Federation. They needed gimmicks. They needed characters. They needed larger-than-life personalities. They needed colorful costumes and wacky catchphrases and cartoonish villains. The irony was almost painful. The World Wrestling Federation itself was struggling in 1993. Vince McMahon's company was dealing with the steroid trial, declining ratings, and a creative direction that was running out of steam. The formula WCW was trying to copy was already failing in the hands of the people who invented it. What they actually needed was to play to their own strengths. Great wrestling, compelling rivalries, believable athletes, the things that had always been the foundation of NWA and WCW programming. Instead, they were trying to imitate a company that was itself struggling in 1993 and doing it badly. And then came August, and the single most famous disaster of the entire year. The Shockmaster. WCW was building toward the War Games match at Fall Brawl. The babyface team of Sting, Davey Boy Smith, and Dustin Rhodes needed a fourth man to take on the heel squad of Vader, Sid Vicious, and Harlem Heat. WCW wanted a big surprise reveal, something dramatic, something that would get people talking. They took Fred Ottman, a journeyman big man who had most recently worked in the World Wrestling Federation as Typhoon of the Natural Disasters tag team, and who happened to be Dusty Rhodes' brother-in-law. They stuck him in a costume that defied description: jeans, a furry vest, and a Star Wars stormtrooper helmet covered in silver glitter. The glitter was getting into his eyes through the eye holes, so someone grabbed a pair of pantyhose from a secretary, cut out 2 pieces, and glued them over the holes. He could barely see. The plan was simple. During the Flair for the Gold talk show segment at Clash of the Champions 24, Sting would dramatically announce his mystery partner. Pyro would go off, and the Shockmaster would burst through a breakaway wall onto the set, delivering a threatening promo voiced by Ole Anderson from backstage. They rehearsed it during the day. It went perfectly, no problems at all. But then, sometime between the rehearsal and the live broadcast, someone added a 2x4 piece of lumber across the bottom of the breakaway wall, a framing board to stabilize the drywall. Ottman did not know it was there. He could not see it through the glitter-encrusted helmet with pantyhose glued over the eye holes. The segment went live. Sting announced that his partner would shock the world. The pyro fired, and the Shockmaster burst through the wall, caught his foot on the 2x4, and fell flat on his face on live national television. His helmet flew off and rolled across the set. The glittery stormtrooper headpiece bounced away while Fred Ottman, unmasked and exposed, scrambled on the floor trying to figure out what had just happened. Ole Anderson, backstage and unable to see, continued delivering a threatening voiceover into his microphone, completely unaware that the character he was voicing had just eaten the floor in the most humiliating way imaginable. On the set, everyone broke character. Davey Boy Smith could be heard shouting something profane about Ottman falling on his rear end. Ric Flair, who had sensibly positioned himself off-camera before the reveal because he suspected something might go wrong, was reportedly doubled over with laughter. Sid Vicious and Harlem Heat, the heels who were supposed to be terrified of this mystery opponent, were trying not to crack up on camera. Dustin Rhodes, watching from backstage, laughed so hard that people nearly had to take him to a hospital because he could not stop. Keep in mind, Fred Ottman was his brother-in-law. Dusty later alleged that the 2x4 was deliberately placed there as an act of sabotage by producer David Crockett, who reportedly thought the entire Shockmaster concept was terrible. Whether that is true or not has never been definitively confirmed, but it certainly added another layer of dysfunction to an already dysfunctional situation. The character was destroyed before it ever had a chance. They tried to salvage it by repackaging Ottman as a clumsy, lovable oaf named Uncle Fred, who wore a hard hat and jeans. He went from being positioned as a monster who would intimidate Vader to being a comedy act who could barely get through a doorway without falling over. It remains, to this day, universally regarded as the worst debut in the history of professional wrestling. But somehow, WCW was not done finding new ways to hurt itself. The Shockmaster debacle happened in August, and October had a surprise of its own. Let us talk about the Davey Boy Smith situation first, because it feeds into the larger picture of WCW's inability to develop and maintain main event talent. The British Bulldog had come into WCW earlier in 1993 after being fired from the World Wrestling Federation during the steroid scandal. WCCW pushed him immediately. He was paired with Sting as a top babyface. He was positioned in a major feud against Vader and Sid Vicious. WCW even tested the waters by having Smith defeat Vader on a house show in the United Kingdom, albeit by disqualification, which meant the title did not officially change hands. But the reaction from British fans was enormous, and it was clear WCW saw Smith as a legitimate challenger to Vader's throne. And then he got into a bar fight. Over the summer of 1993, Smith was out at a bar when another patron allegedly began flirting with his wife, Diana Hart Smith. Smith did not take kindly to this. The resulting altercation was severe enough that the other man was hospitalized with significant injuries. While WCW did not fire Smith immediately, the legal fallout from the incident became an escalating problem. Eventually, the British Bulldog's WCW run came to a premature end. Another potential main event star wasted. Another investment that yielded nothing. And then came the Sid situation. This one nearly killed the entire company. Sid Vicious was the chosen one. WCW had spent the better part of 1993 building toward one moment: Sid versus Vader for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship at Starrcade, the biggest show of the year. The company's version of WrestleMania. The show that absolutely had to draw. The show that, if it bombed, could convince Turner Broadcasting to pull the plug on professional wrestling entirely. Sid was the man. He had the look. He had the intensity. He had the crowd reactions. The plan was in place. The marketing was in motion. The build-up had been happening for months. And then, on October 27, 1993, 4 days after Halloween Havoc, WCW was on a tour of England. The company was in Blackburn in Lancashire. After the show, the wrestlers ended up at the Moat House Hotel bar. And that is where Sid Vicious and Arn Anderson got into a real fight. The details of what started the altercation vary depending on who is telling the story. Sid had been making disparaging remarks about Ric Flair, and Anderson, one of Flair's closest friends, took offense. Words were exchanged. A drink was thrown. The situation escalated. Later that night, after the bar closed and the wrestlers returned to their rooms, Sid went to Anderson's door to continue the confrontation, reportedly carrying a broken chair leg. Anderson opened the door holding a pair of scissors. What followed was a vicious brawl in the hotel hallway. By the time Too Cold Scorpio broke it up, both men were covered in blood. They were rushed to the hospital. Anderson suffered over 20 stab wounds, primarily to his chest and stomach. Sid was stabbed 4 times. It was a bloody, ugly incident that could easily have resulted in someone dying. The fallout was immediate. Multiple wrestlers threatened to walk out of the company if Sid was not fired. WCW had no choice. They released Sid Vicious effective immediately. Now think about what this meant. WCW had spent months building to Sid versus Vader at Starrcade. They had invested enormous amounts of television time, promotional money, and creative energy into this feud. The entire direction of the company's biggest show of the year was built around these two men. And now, with barely 6 weeks until Starrcade, one half of the main event was gone. Fired, banned from the company. And WCW had already taped television content featuring Sid as a championship contender that had not even aired yet. The company was in free fall. They needed someone, anyone who could step into the main event of Starrcade and make it feel like a credible championship match. Someone the fans would accept. Someone who could draw money, someone who could save the company from going under. And once again, like he had done so many times before and would do so many times after, Ric Flair bailed WCW out. Flair stepped into the main event slot against Vader at Starrcade 1993. The match was promoted as Title vs. Career, Vader's WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Flair's entire professional wrestling career. If Flair lost, he was done. It was a phenomenal match, one of the best either man ever had, a career-defining performance from both competitors. Flair, at an age when most wrestlers are winding down, delivered one of the greatest big match performances of his legendary career. The psychology was perfect. The emotion was real. The crowd was molten hot. Flair won the title, the crowd went crazy, and Starrcade was saved. The show did enough business to keep WCW alive for another year. But the fact that the company had to rely on a last-minute emergency replacement for its biggest show of the year because its chosen main eventer had stabbed a fellow wrestler with scissors tells you everything you need to know about the state of WCW in 1993. And we have not even talked about some of the other miscellaneous disasters that littered the year. There was the Battle Bowl pay-per-view in November, a standalone event built around a concept that was confusing on a good day. The lethal lottery format paired random wrestlers together in tag team matches, with the winners advancing to a battle royal. The concept called for 40 participants, but WCW could only scrape together 33 wrestlers, forcing them to use enhancement talent like Rip Rogers on a pay-per-view card. The show drew a 0.27 buy rate, the lowest in WCW pay-per-view history up to that point. It would not be surpassed until the company was in its final death spiral in 2000. There was the ongoing fiasco on syndicated television where Tom Zenk was put in a mask and passed off as Shane Douglas. This was a direct consequence of the Disney tapings. Douglas had either left or been fired, but WCW still had pre-taped content featuring a masked tag team partner for Ricky Steamboat that was supposed to be Douglas. Rather than reshoot the footage or simply acknowledge the change, WCW stuck Zenk under a mask and hoped nobody would notice. Everyone noticed. There was the Slamboree pay-per-view in May, which featured a Legends reunion component that produced nothing memorable and several outright bad matches. There was the Fall Brawl War Games match itself, which despite featuring Vader, Sting, and Sid, was considered one of the weakest War Games bouts ever, ending with the Shockmaster winning by submission via bear hug. There were countless house shows that drew embarrassingly small crowds, sometimes fewer than 1,000 people, in buildings that could hold 10 times that number. And through all of this, the truly maddening part was that the actual wrestling was often very good. Vader and Sting had incredible matches throughout the year. Ricky Steamboat and Lord Steven Regal were putting on technical masterclasses for the television championship. The Hollywood Blondes, before they were broken up, were having some of the best tag team matches in years. Dustin Rhodes was coming into his own as a talented worker. Rick Rude was delivering quality main event matches. Chris Benoit and Too Cold Scorpio were doing outstanding work in the undercard. Bobby Eaton was still Bobby Eaton. The talent was never the problem. The wrestling was never the problem. The problem was everything that surrounded the wrestling: the management, the booking decisions, the creative direction, the backstage politics, the financial mismanagement, the block tapings, the leaked results, the terrible gimmicks, the wasted pushes, the inability to develop new stars, the constant reliance on older names, the 2 world title fiasco, the Shockmaster, the scissors, the bar fights, all of it. WCW in 1993 was a company at war with itself. It had all the ingredients to succeed and absolutely no idea how to combine them. Every time something positive happened, the company found a way to undermine it. Every time a wrestler got over, management found a reason to cut them down. Every time a show had potential, some backstage disaster derailed it. The year ended with Ric Flair holding the World Championship. It ended with the company still technically alive. It ended with Eric Bischoff still in charge, having survived a year that would have destroyed most executives. And it ended with a lifeline on the horizon, because Hulk Hogan was coming in 1994, bringing with him mainstream attention and the promise of a financial turnaround. But make no mistake, 1993 was the year WCW nearly died. Not from external competition, not from the Monday Night Wars, which had not even started yet, not from anything the World Wrestling Federation did to them. WCW nearly died because of WCW, because of decisions made by its own executives, because of incidents caused by its own wrestlers, because of a culture that valued politics over product and ego over common sense. The Hollywood Blondes should have been the foundation of the tag division for years. Sid should have main evented Starrcade as planned. The Shockmaster should have stayed in whatever dimension he came from. The Disney tapings should have been abandoned the moment the first set of results leaked. The 2 world title situation should have been resolved in a single segment of television. Paul Roma should never have been within 100 feet of the 4 horsemen. In hindsight, WCW's problems in 1993 seem painfully obvious. But at the time, the company either could not see them or deliberately chose not to, because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that the people in charge did not know what they were doing. Something World Championship Wrestling leadership was never willing to do. That refusal to adapt and constant doubling down on bad decisions was the real disease, while disasters like the Shockmaster or leaked tapings were merely symptoms. What makes it tragic is that WCW failed to truly learn from this year, repeating many of the same mistakes later despite incredible success during the Monday Night Wars, including 83 consecutive weeks beating the World Wrestling Federation in the ratings and becoming a cultural phenomenon. When WCW finally collapsed in 2001 and was purchased by Vince McMahon, it was not because of outside forces, but because the company had long proven its own capacity for self-destruction. 1993 did not kill WCW, but it revealed beyond any doubt that given every possible tool for success, the company was fully capable of sabotaging itself. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the wildest moments in wrestling history. Until next time.